Hello and welcome to another episode of Planet Outlook. My guest today needs no introduction. He is one of most world's leading tiger biologists, Dr. Ulas Karant. For half a century, he has been working tirelessly using cutting-edge science to protect India's endangered tigers. Thank you, Dr. Karant, for joining us on Outlook's new platform called Planet Outlook. Thank you so much.
Happy to be here.
So I want to begin from your early days. So the world's leading tiger biologist was once a mechanical engineer, a tractor salesman, a tobacco farmer, if I'm correct, which many people may not know about this many twists and turns in your career. So, so give us a kind of an overall kind of thing, how it started in the 50s and how you took up wildlife science as a major career.
I think it started at a very young age. I was very a hardwired naturalist. I loved going to the wandering around, watching birds. And my father was a well-known writer. He didn't believe in formal schooling, so till the age of 10, I never went to a school. So I was bird watching. I was getting a little bit of lessons at home, and I think the obsession with nature was there, but this focus on tigers came very early. I remember the first tiger I saw was in a circus in this village called Puttur, where I grew up, which is 50 kilometers from Bangalore. I was a little boy and I was just blown away by the beauty and symmetry of these animals in the ring. And then next day, for a small fee, you could go and actually go behind the tent and watch the animals in their cages. And I was there within a meter of a tiger that was just staring back at me with its mesmerizing eyes, lying flat, and there's something clicked. And ever since then, I've been fascinated with tigers. Started drawing tigers and things like that as a little boy. So when I got out of school, I had to make a living, and there was no career in wildlife. So I became an engineer, and after working in a I graduated from NITK Surathkal, which is called the Karnataka Regional College. But I hated every minute of college, and I cut classes. Uh, I climbed Kudremukh in 1966. I rode a motorcycle to Nagarhole in 1967. I was desperately trying to see wildlife, and particularly tigers. But the scenario was dismal. Tigers were being hunted and paraded, and forests were being cleared both for agriculture by farmers as well as by the forest department for logging. So I had no hope. I thought by the time I was able to, in a few more years, all tigers would be gone. I tried desperately. But in the 70s, uh, things changed very dramatically in the early 70s, just when I graduated from college. Mrs. Gandhi was in power and she brought in, this is all too well known. I am not going to read it. She brought the Wildlife Protection Act and she turned the enforcement capability that was within the Forest Department into protection. There was a first generation conservationists, people like M. Krishnan, Salim Ali, and others who kind of influenced her to take these decisions. So, in a dramatic decade between, say, early 70s and 80s, wildlife started coming back spectacularly. And I kept going back to Nagarhole. But when I was in engineering, I had read an article by George Schaller in the Life magazine. Later, I read his book, Deer and the Tiger. Made it very clear to me that this is what I wanted to do. I didn't want to be an amateur naturalist. I didn't want to be a tour guide. I didn't do anything else other than do wildlife biology and science. Somehow brought together my hardwired biology with my little bit of learned engineering. So I started trying to get out of this engineering profession and become a biologist somewhere, like Schaller. But it wasn't easy. I could not get into a wildlife school in the US. It cost too much money, and I didn't even have the right undergraduate degree. So I started, then I got out of this factory job, sold tractors and power tillers, rode over a motorcycle all over Karnataka. And then, uh, not satisfied with that, I actually bought a farm in 1976, not very far from Nagarhole. And I could spend a lot more time in Nagarhole with my friends in the forest department. So at that point in time, I got an opportunity to visit US on a Rotary fellowship, and I ended up in the after the Rotary trip was over, I went to University of Wisconsin, where the field of wildlife biology was actually started by Aldo Leopold. A friend of mine, an engineer friend of mine, was working in the university, so I stayed with him for a month. I visited the department, and I also knew Dr. George Schaller, my inspiration, had also graduated from Wisconsin. So I met Leopold's last PhD student, who was an old man, who was the dean of the wildlife school, called Dr. McCabe. And I told him my dilemma. I want to really get into this field. But you have been wandering around. Have you been keeping field notes? And I said, yes, I have wandered all over the meticulously kept notes. I have a lot of natural history observations. He said, start writing it all up, start publishing it. That will open doors to you. I had heard about this study of tigers that the Smithsonian scientists had done in Nepal, taking George Schaller's notebook and pen study to a new level using radio telemetry for the first time. Mel Sundquist and John Seidensticker, who had radio collared tigers at the conference. So I went to Bombay. I presented a short paper there, but I connected with the entire Smithsonian group, and particularly Mel Sundquist, who by then was a professor in University of Florida. And he was, I think, impressed by my enthusiasm as well as clarity of thinking on this subject. So he said, if you take the GRE and score well, sufficiently high, you get a full fellowship, I would be happy to take you on as a graduate student. So in 1986, I started collecting some data even before I went to Florida, and also took the GRE. I made the grade. So I went to University of Florida, did my master's there. What I what I didn't have, what they didn't have, was the field experience that I had. It was an international school with a lot of Brazilians, Mexicans, not just American students. But I had this 15 years of experience of all kinds, wildlife experience, rural sociology, which you don't learn in a school, all sorts of things. So I did extremely well in that school, unlike in engineering. So when I was about to finish, Dr. George Schaller visited the University of Florida. He gave a talk. He gave a talk in our class, and I met him at a cocktail party in the evening. And he's a bit of a cynic. He looked at me and said, "Oh, your generation of Indians, they come here, they never go back. I suppose you will do the same." So I told George, "No, I will go back to India and I'll write a better tiger book than yours." And he said, "Then come and see me in New York." So that's how I ended up. And he hired me for WCS, sent me back to India in 88 with a salary for the first time, paid for having fun watching wildlife. So that's been the start of a 30-year career.
So which is a better book now, The Deer and the Tiger, or your Science of no, Counting Tigers?
Now, George's book is still the best, but I'm only 72. I'm going to write a better one. I'm working on a number of them. Put together, hopefully they'll be a little better.
So it's amazing to hear you still at work every day at 9 o'clock in sharp. This is wonderful to hear. But Dr. Karan, 50 years is a long period of time. And firstly, I want to ask how much the habitat change has changed. You've been tracking, monitoring tigers for 50 years in Karnataka. So, firstly, before going to tigers, I want to ask how much the forest landscape has changed.
Years back, or whatever, in the mid 60s, there were two clear things. Uh, Forests were being cut down as well as exploited intensively. And contrary to the simplified notion that it was all timber industry, etc., it was a complex set of factors. People were clearing forests for subsistence farming. Larger farmers were encroaching the forest. Livestock numbers were incredibly high. Forests were overrun with cattle. Market for non-timber forest products was booming. So there were all these pressures coming from local rural societies. On top of it, the department's own policy was to convert natural forests to um, single crops like teak or in some cases eucalyptus, whatever. So the forests were really under retreat. And the Western Ghats in particular, large hydel projects were seen as necessary for the energy that industrialization demanded. So many large hydel projects were coming up. So the cumulative impact on forests was massive. And on top of it, there was absolutely no law against hunting. There were very, very weak laws. The Wildlife Protection Act was not there. So you would be very surprised that tigers were hunted so massively. Again, not just by we have these examples of princes and British upper classes who have shot hundreds of tigers, but the little guys did their best too. There is one hunter who is no more, who I knew he lived near Nagarhole, never entered the forest, just sitting in his village about 15 kilometers from Nagarhole. Shot 27 tigers between 1948 and 1965. For each, he got a bounty of 100 rupees. There was a bounty on tigers. So there was this massive assault on tigers. But even worse was the depletion of the prey. People had hunted out the prey. So in the 40s and 50s, or even almost from the 30s, tigers were actually more abundant around villages because the prey base was cattle. Literally hundreds of thousands of cattle were there. So it was very, very different from what it is now. Cannot believe, and if people think things were pristine and better 50 years ago, they're dead wrong. Most people who are now used to going to Kana or Ranthambore and watching four tigers before breakfast have no idea what things were
Al- Also, since you had spent a lot of years in farming just next to the Nagarhole, so there is this one school of thought which says that farmers and locals around forest dwellers are the best protectors of the forest ecosystem. But you have an experience, a different point of view also. So, so just tell us
like.
a little bit. Yeah.
Yes, there are two things here. I think it depends on the context. For example, a lot of these ideas come from the context of South America, where giant swaths of rainforests are being cleared for industry or industrial scale farming and big dams, as opposed to having a small number of people living at very low densities and living off the land, where certainly the latter is a better model for preserving the forest. But when you come to India, where number of human beings is 3 to 400 per square kilometer, and forests have shrunk, wildlife areas have shrunk to less than 4 or 5%, that simply doesn't apply. The question is not whether rural people are good or bad, or whether they even want to save wildlife or not. They have to make a living, they are linked to market. So in terms of maximizing their benefits, they are no different from a small town merchant or an engineer working for a salary or a bureaucrat. So when that happens, there is very little opportunity for them to sacrifice their own interest to, you know, suffer a tiger or anything else. It's the land, it's the fight, because we are large bodied animals like tigers and elephants. We need the same resources from the land that people these animals need. So it's a competition for space and energy and nutrition. So I don't see a situation where, you know, if you simply remove all enforcement, everything will come back. And I have lived next to the forest and farm for 8 years. And I don't have a romantic view of this villager hugging the tree, being, you know, he's trying to eke out a living. So he has problems.
So now coming back to tigers, this entire period of 50 years kind of thing, you must have some remarkable experience on foot with the big cat. So if we can hear a couple of them.
It's actually strange. If you are on foot, you are less likely to see a tiger. I guarantee you, even now, if you go to Kana or any of these places, you are seeing those tigers between or an elephant, and the tiger does not perceive you as a threat to it. It doesn't see the human being on foot. And I tested this very interestingly. When I was radio tracking tigers, after about 6 to 8 months, the animals got used to my car. It was a green gypsy. I would not disturb them. I would predict their movement and go and wait there. And they slowly got used to my car, and they used to mate next to the car. Mother and cubs will go, leopards will get used to my presence. But if I stepped out of the car, they would take off and go. So, chance of seeing a tiger on, if you see a tiger on foot, it's spectacular. The experience is spectacular. But I've seen more tigers either from an elephant back or from a car or from a machan, waiting in a machan, than actually on foot. But I have seen them on foot. When this is particularly when you're doing line transects, in which you cut a trail and just two people go and you literally sneak on the trail, counting herbivores. And I've seen them at very close quarters on foot, and generally they're not aggressive. They just so, and seeing a tiger on foot is a special experience, but in fact, the most thrilling experience that way has been of darting these tigers for collaring them. This is in 1990. Nobody had darted tigers in India. And even now, the technique that we used has not been used. Mostly, most of the dartings, even today, are being done either on habituated animals in uh, tourism zones or animals that are cornered in some circumstances, mobbed, etc., and then they are darted. So we had to catch free ranging tigers. And that is very difficult. We had to put a bait out, the tiger would come and kill the bait. Then this is a technique developed in Nepal and perhaps Bihar. We had adapted it, Sunquist and I had adapted it. Surround the tiger with a white cloth fence, which is 100 meters or more from the tiger. I would sit on a tree, barely 15 feet off the ground, and then this team will go and disturb the tiger. But it's not like a hunt where you make a lot of noise and make the animal run. That doesn't work because to dart it, the animal has to come really slowly, casually. So people would go and just get on elephant back and mutter sounds and approach the tiger. It would get off, and this white cloth acted like a psychological barrier. The tiger can easily go through it, but it doesn't. It's afraid. So it kind of bounces off and used to come right under my tree. And I used to dart it. And those were really kind of heart stopping moments because, you know, with a gun, you can really harm the tiger. With this little thing, you can't. It just, you know, it's an injection, and after 100 meters, the tiger collapses. There have been cases where a tigress with cubs, if she came and looked up, there was one case in Nepal, she did pull out somebody out the tree. I had to think of that. So those were some of the most exciting moments, catching tigers.
Yeah, because I was asking specifically because some of the books we have read and which has inspired a lot of us through the generations, like Corbett's book or Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book, has portrayed the tiger also in a very bad light as a man eater, if I quote to use the word. A lot of people who are watching us think always the tiger, and the next word comes as a man eater. So this dispels the myth that the tiger is not a man eater, born man eater. There are accidents, obviously. So, so do you think that this literature, popular literature, has also played a very big role in kind of putting this not so good label on this such a majestic cat?
I don't romanticize the tiger. See, most tigers are afraid of human beings. They have a search image, and their search image is an ungulate, a sambar, a gaur, or a cow, or something like that. Something on 2 feet that has been hunting them for centuries, they are afraid of human beings. The normal tigers are afraid of human beings. But there's a small fraction of them that, for various reasons, lose this fear, and their search image now includes human beings as a easily caught prey, and in fact, a far easier prey to catch than a gaur or sambar. Those become very dangerous because they then persistently hunt human beings. That is, it doesn't mean they don't kill other prey, but whenever they get a chance, they take a human being. So this is man eating. Not when a tiger is cornered or people mob it and it claws somebody. Those tigers are fine. They're still afraid of people. But this persistent man eating behavior, then the tiger is extremely dangerous. I would not go walking in those forests. For example, Sundarban is a good example where for centuries there's an element of the population there which would take people. And you can't just walk around and you are not safe in those circumstances. So we have to make a non-romantic distinction between tiger is a gentleman business, tiger is a fierce man-eating animal all the time. The truth is more gray and shaded.
We want to hear about your the Tiger program that you run in Karnataka, which is been the longest running program on tigers anywhere in the world. It started in 1987, I think, and it ended in 2017. So if you can tell us this about this amazing 30-year-old program monitoring tigers.
It grew organically in some sense because I got into this inspired by Schaller, trained by Sunquist to be a tiger biologist. Ideally, that's what I would have liked to do. Just study tigers, spend my time with them, understand them, and write about them. But as my study continued, its focus also started shifting. One of the Let me cover the science first. See, everybody, and this is also a tradition in North America, partly. People get so focused on these big cats, it all becomes about collaring them, studying them, which is important. But what determines the tiger's very presence and numbers is actually the prey. So there was very little focus on prey in India. So my master's work was to develop techniques for counting prey because earlier guesses and subsequent data show that 500 prey animals roughly are needed to support a single tiger over time. So the major reason for depletion of the tiger is not so much as hunting per se, but also hunting of the prey. So my initial work was on developing good methods for counting. Then I was very interested in behavior and how often they kill the prey, which was the telemetry study. But around 1993, I I started engaging a little with conservation. I met Valmik Thapar, I met other people, and that was the time when this whole tiger poaching business exploded, combined with absolutely ridiculous levels of monitoring that was going on officially. It became very clear to me that while I could have the luxury of just watching tigers and tiger behavior, which is fantastic, the real threat was coming from both hunting of tigers and prey, and we didn't have a good tool to count tigers. So from 87, around 93, 94, I shifted my focus to counting tigers accurately, and counting prey accurately had come before. And around the same time as the conservation, I had got in as a conservationist way before I became a researcher. So I realized that whatever science I did, neither the government nor the decision makers in the local society or district bother about this science. I needed to really inspire and create a group of people who were rooted there to defend the tiger. So I found an opportunity in the line transect sampling because it's very any good naturalist can do it. It's an extremely disciplined job. sometimes dangerous if you're stupid, but it demands a lot of manpower. So all the young people who came to meet me at that time, I started training them in line transact methodology. uh, that became a sort of a recruiting place uh, for these conservationists. There's a very nice paper by Mackenzie Johnson of Duke University on this whole thing. And over time now, many of them have become very eminent biologists themselves. Some have gone into conservation, are leading in that arena. So what this did was to make them think straight. The problem is a lot of people are good naturalists, they are interested, but then they get sidetracked into photography or something else and become, you know, start loving the tiger and become animal welfare advocates. Whereas these guys started from a base of science, have a real view of what's happening to tigers. So that conservation part grew organically, starting from Nagarhole in a small scale. Uh, at the end of the project, we were monitoring the entire Western Ghats Karnataka population, about 6,000 square kilometers, intensively monitored in camera traps and transects and all these techniques. Wider landscapes surveyed using another method called occupancy sampling. And around each park, we had local people who were coffee planters or ran a local cable service or whatever, who were there to defend the tiger. Then some of them became a part of my team. Some of the more committed people, for example, Dr. Samba Kumar, who is sort of my number two throughout this period, he had a good job in ISRO. He quit that and came and joined me and did a PhD. So some of them became professional conservationists. Some of them became amateurs who spend a lot of time on conservation. For example, Praveen Bhargav spends a lot of time filing court cases. He's an advertising guy. But so gradually we built up this network, and with that kind of social base, we were able to, as a group, I was in some sense the think tank for the group. Everybody acted, and we were able to, you know, in some cases, shut down disastrous mining. Intensity of logging was greatly reduced in the 90s because of our arguments and pressure tactics. Then, it was considered almost impossible to relocate people voluntarily with incentives, and we were able to catalyze that process. And now that work is continued by Kriti and also my daughter, and she's doing some conflict mitigation.
Also, you focused all your science on the density more than actual numbers of tigers or actual numbers of prey. You always focused on density, and that's what you've been telling all of us over the years that what the government or the Indian government does once a 4-year count is not the way to go, kind of thing. We need to monitor the annual population, kind of thing. So, so are you kind of the present tiger numbers India has posted kind of a record number? So are you happy with the numbers, or you think that no, there is some anomaly in kind of counting, and we should go by a different process?
No, I think it's a more complicated question. I don't think it's density versus numbers per se.
Hmm.
Uh, what is important is that for us to realize that 80 to 90% of the tigers are concentrated in 10 to 15% of the habitat. And these are source populations. If they blink out, tigers will disappear everywhere. So your focus has to be on monitoring these populations using the best methodology. So you have not only numbers, you also have how many are surviving, recruitment, reproduction. You can get all this. We have shown the science, how it can be done. That is key. And that needs to be done rigorously, scientifically every year. Then at this larger scale of whether tigers are there or not, or they're creating new populations or old ones are disappearing, that can be done in once in 4 or 5 years. What the government is trying to do, the scheme is fundamentally flawed. And this is because I would put it on the Tiger Task Force because they did not rely on other people's expertise, nor did they have the expertise. So they allowed the government to get away with this when they had a completely new chance, moving beyond the Pugmark census to come up with a robust, proper monitoring system. They blew it by first making it a government monopoly of the Forest Department and WIA, and secondly by not laying any criteria. It was so unfortunately from 2005 going on in a manner that's fundamentally scientifically wrong, and it is costing far more than it needs to cost. It's unbelievable the amount of money that's going to count tigers. You don't need that much. You can do it in 10% of the time. It's not being done the right way. So what aggravates me is that it's not been done. We have shown in Western Ghats, roughly 15% of India's tigers have been monitored for 20 years with the best methodology. And we have the results to show all the data parameters that I talked about. Here they go and collect once in 4 years a massive amount of unstructured, poor data. Then it's hidden from public view. Nobody sees it ever. And some statistics are spouted in parliament and in grey literature and some glossy reports. Those reports have more cute tiger pictures than any science or data. So this, when the amount of money Indian taxpayer has put into this, I think it's a typical example of inefficient public sector doing what should be left to research institutions, NGOs, and scientists, and the government withdraws and just moves away from these areas like tourism, counting animals. I don't think the government.
Also, by the government's own admission, 30% of tigers are outside the protected area network. I mean, they are just there, kind of thing, at God's mercy. 30% is almost like 1,000 tigers, which are just living with no protection at all. How worried are you in kind of thing, and what's the road ahead? And also, in context to this, in 2017, I remember two science papers coming which says like the Ranthambore population has kind of lost all genetic link with the central Indian population. And likewise, it may happen in other parts of the country. So, how worried are you, and what's the way? Because 1,000 tigers, even if we go beyond India, even the Amur tiger is kind of it's about 500-600 kind of tigers. 1,000 tigers is a huge amount.
But I don't believe any of these numbers. This comes from this obsession with what I meant was you do need accurate monitoring of, I would say 85 to 90% of the tigers are in key protected areas. Okay. 10 to 15% are outside, but these outside population only in some areas they're breeding and reproducing. Rest are just animals going from these sources. So this business that there's 25% there, 30% there, I don't buy it at all.
Okay.
Second thing is, since we are not monitoring this number at all, if you monitor this accurately, you will get a good handle on 90% of India's tigers. And you can always add a small fraction and say this is the total number. So if you take a very coarse view, this is partly data, partly guesswork. I would say in the early 70s or late 60s, when we became tiger recovery, there was a lot more habitat, but there were perhaps 2,000 tigers. And now, with all the circus that's gone on, 50 years of such heavy investment, they are saying there are 3,000 tigers. And then they're also saying we cannot have more than 3,500. I think this is ridiculous.
You said 15,000. We can have 15,000 tigers in your interview.
If you manage every inch of available tiger habitat for optimally, that may not be possible, but those numbers have to be set high, or most of these people should be sent home. Why should we support such a vast bureaucracy which has managed from 2,000 to 3,000 in 50 years and now willing to throw up its hand in 100 more tigers? We certainly don't need such a big structure. I think the biggest mistake of the Tiger Task Force was creating this bureaucracy. There used to be a smaller Project Tiger, which was a part of the wildlife department. Now this has become an organism in itself that has become bigger than all the wildlife, with massive funding and also dabbling into cheetahs and snow leopards and all. And the government talks about minimum governance, etc. I'm not seeing that in the wildlife sector. It's actually becoming more and more in the older model. So I think it's a serious management issue. Just relook from the bottom, not cosmetic window dressing, saying we have more tigers here, this tiger went there.
But also, are we doing good science, or are we communicating the good science to policymakers?
No, I don't think we are. We were. I have done good science, in my opinion, and we have put it out in public domain. Then it's up to the policymakers to use it. See, for example, you can't force the policymakers. They are in a fairly exalted position in our country. Unfortunately, because it's been made a government monopoly, the science quality has been poor. It's not that we don't have bright biologists. We have some of the smartest people, but they're not in the government. So, what we have done in telecom and agriculture and other sectors, pulling in, for example, journalism, media, if you make it all government owned, you remember the Doordarshan of the old days? What's happening in the wildlife sector? And 7 years of this government has made no difference. They are following the same track as earlier. So, to me, that's the issue. The country has incredibly talented young researchers, research institutions in which they are functioning. It's not just tigers in wildlife, but they are not allowed to systematically work. Access is controlled because the government has the monopoly of being inside.
And how much this new technology coming in has helped scientific work? You have this, you've seen the entire thing from the beginnings. Uh, you were
Oh,
the
sir.
first radio caller, and now radio callers are much lighter, much sophisticated. Or
Well, I think some of these new technologies have been absolutely critical because they can get things that you couldn't get otherwise. Telemetry is the best example. My professor Mel Sunquist was there when it was delivered in 1960s in the Minnesota for the first time allows us to continuously track individuals, and behavior of individuals provides a key to understanding why something is happening. It answers the why question. The modern telemetry systems are better, but in some sense they are also bad because now from the comfort of your laptop you can get the data using satellites, and so fewer people are actually doing that really hard. What I realized when I was tracking tigers, it was VHF tracking. You had one animal collared, but because you were with that animal every day for long periods, you saw a lot of interactions, other non-collared animals coming. A whole lot of biology simply doesn't come from your satellite data. But still, telemetry is a fantastic technology, more than tigers for species like whales and Amur falcons and lots of these things. Camera traps, again, same thing. Camera traps could get good pictures. Chuck McDougall, FW champion early, all took great pictures, but it was not a monitoring tool because it was too cumbersome and too expensive. Now you can deploy hundreds of cameras. At the peak of our work, we had 500 camera traps laid out in different places systematically. That and it gives you a lot of once you identify the individual, it gives you a lot of information. So that's been a big step. And more recently, the DNA based research, you can identify individuals, age, sex, relatedness, and the new techniques like CRISPR, where you can blow up the amount of information you have to get at those parameters. So it's a very exciting time. A lot of good if we use all this technology with human ingenuity and creativity. Where we are failing is not because we are buying thousands of camera traps. And I know of an institution that had radio collared hundreds of tigers. There's no, there's a PhD student who has collared 10 tigers or 8 tigers. Where's the data? Because it's the collaring technology itself becomes a obsession, and what you get out of the technology can only come if you have committed people and creative people. That can't be created. That's where the mismatch is. The human ingenuity. creativity of the best Indian scientists and the best technology are not matching.
I want to broaden now this thing to a little bit, also include other tiger range countries. So now there's an effort of basically doubling numbers, as the St. Petersburg conference in 2010 said. So which countries do you think tigers may do well or doing well? What's the current status of global? So India has, okay, India has done well, but which are the other countries which you think?
Yeah, see, I don't believe India has done well. India has done better than other countries, which is different from doing well by your potential. The two are different things. India has invested hugely, and India has a tradition for tolerating wildlife. There's so many pluses we have, the other countries don't have. So, yet from 2000 to 3000, we have gone in 50 years, but other countries have done much worse, sure. So, even that, I would say many countries have just, for what I don't want to get into their social circumstances, tigers have been wiped out from Cambodia, they're disappeared from Vietnam and Laos, and I'm talking of, in recent years, Burma, they are on their, although there's plenty of forest, they are on their last stand. So India has certainly done well. Nepal, for a poor country, small country, has done well. Uh, and Russia, because of its size, uh, the land area of the tiger habitat is huge. It's more than the size of entire South India. So there are tigers there. I think Indonesia is trying very hard, although their problems are like ours. It's very bad, but they have a vibrant NGO sector and they are struggling. They're doing well. Uh, they're trying to do well. And I think Thailand has done the best job among all these countries. They have stable political boundaries to their forest. They have a young cadre, and their forest cadre is all fully trained in wildlife, their entire forest department. And they encourage research, engage outsiders. Their protection was not good, now it's picking up. So, Thailand, I see as probably the uh, best among the countries outside India in terms of where they were 20 years ago and where they are now.
How do you see the future of tigers? There is the shrinking spaces. We have talked about forest corridors, which are still in a very gray area, and this our development is kind of has kind of skyrocketed. So, so in context, in the present context, the way you see how what's the future of tigers?
So I think what we have to do is learn from the past for making the tiger's future secure. So what have we learned? Say, let us look at the Western Ghats, which I'm very familiar with, but the story is not that different from some other parts of India, whether it's Uttarakhand or Central. When I told you about the dismal days when I was seeking tigers and seeing the only dead ones in the 50s and 60s, there were probably 70 to 100, probably closer to 70 tigers in the entire Malnad landscape of 30,000 square kilometers. Today, there are 350 to 400 tigers. So clearly, there has been development, there has been economic development, human populations probably three times more, and people are consuming more. Yet, we have done something right because we do have more tigers. So if you extrapolate, uh, and you, so that's one. Second, if you look at the map of India as a whole, most of our tigers are found in Western Ghats, a cluster in central India, Kana, Bandhavgarh, Tadoba, Maharashtra, that block, and in Uttarakhand along the Terai and in Nepal. But the most extensive forests are in Orissa, Jharkhand, Bihar, northeastern hill states. These are literally bereft of tigers. So it's not that there is no habitat. Question is to maintain forests with sufficient prey base. That is really the challenge. So if you can meet that challenge, if you can replicate what you have achieved in some of our good protected areas, that's why I say there is room for 10,000 tigers or more. But we have to be very clear. If you go on spending more and money in the same protected reserves and wasting money and actually damaging habitat, making it like a Disneyland, which is what our tiger reserves are becoming, then you won't get to that goal. To me, that's really the challenge. And if India can do that, there is vast habitats in Southeast Asia, far more than in India. So we can have 40, 50,000 tigers. So I'm not pessimistic because I have seen with my own eyes, not all things that are happening are bad. Yes, infrastructure projects are bad. Some of the technologies intruding into tiger habitat are problems. But I have also seen in China, they have, they have put tunnels for transport, and tunnels have actually kept the connectivity intact because it doesn't disturb the surface and cause as much damage. It's more expensive, but we have tiny stretches compared to China. The Western Ghats is a narrow strip. So some of these technologies, like these tall bridges, tunnels, can be positives. uh, Two big pressures I have seen in my life. One was livestock. That pressure is almost vanishing from the more developed parts of Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, because small diesel vehicles have completely replaced these millions of carts and whatever the carts need to keep going, the wood as well as the animals, animal draft. Hunting was driven primarily because people wanted protein. Wages were low. It was one way of getting protein. Now there is farm chicken and protein available everywhere. Wages are not 2 rupees per day or 3 rupees per day, they are 600 rupees per day. This has again given access to protein to people, and that I see as a positive. And you look at the social entertainment value of hunting. When I was growing up in Puttur, almost every other man from a certain community or a caste or landed gentry went with a gun in hand, and it was social entertainment. It was a lot of things. Today they are all watching cricket. They are watching television. That whole thing about hunting being necessary for protein as well as social interactions has gone. Of course, enforcement is necessary. If you let it loose, they will go and hunt again. So I don't see modernity and advancing technology as only the enemy. It definitely has some negatives, but I think it also has byproducts, unintended byproducts we should leverage to promote conservation.
And I want to end today by asking you one last question. There are a lot of young people who are watching us chatting. There, many would be enthusiastic about taking up a career in wildlife science. What's the message from you, kind of, to them?
Oh, it's a fantastic career because it's like somebody love playing cricket and somebody is playing you to do it. So I would not exchange my profession with anybody, but it has to be tempered with reason because it's not like you are in software or biotechnology. The options are very limited, and particularly because of this government policy of keeping bright young people away from the forest. If that changes, if our universities absorb more ecologists, then the front they can be absorbed. So they have to enter this profession only if they are prepared to go through some struggle. But it certainly is something I would not change my career with anybody. And it is reason, logic, and science that has to drive it. It's not just emotion. See, if you are just love watching animals, then you can be a tour guide, you can be something else. And if you are really mentally determined to protect the tiger, you should be in the forest department because that's your direct responsibility. There are forest officers who have mentored me who are incredible people, Sanjay Dev Roy, PK Sen, and even the people because of whom we have wildlife today. This is their legacy. So there is enough scope for people, but you should be clear what you want. It may not be necessarily wildlife science, but it has to do something with wildlife. You have to be very clear before you jump into the science side of things.
Thank you, Dr. Karan. Thank you so much once again. And I am especially looking forward to that book, which is a better one from the deer and the tiger. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been good being with you.